I'm Chuck Tabor. I'm the interim dean of the graduate school. I want to welcome you to the Provost lecture series. The purpose of this lecture series, which is only 2 years old, is to give graduate students an opportunity to talk to a general audience. It will include people from all across campus and even sometimes to some of our affiliated institutions like Brook Ellison or Cold Spring Harbor. The opportunity here is really to highlight some of the excellent research that graduate students on campus are doing. And I've been at almost every lecture. I can tell you it's one of the real highlights of this job because it's just astonishing to me how wonderful our graduate students are. The intellectual vitality that they bring to the campus is just incredible. I'm not going to introduce our speaker today, but I do just want to briefly make a personal comment that I can take credit for being the person who brought Brooke Ellison to Stony Brook campus originally. Although, of course, since she was local, she may have come for other reasons as well. But I did recruit her to the PhD program in political science at Stony Brook University before she became a sociologist. So we're going to have Brooke now introduced by Catherine Morell, her advisor. Thank you.
So much about it that I have to write it down. Okay, so it is my true and genuine honor to present to you Brooke Ellison, who quite literally will be receiving her PhD in the Department of Sociology here at Stony, as you know, where she has excelled at a pace and with a level of expertise that really is unparalleled. However, Brooke's educational accomplishments have all along been quite astounding. She earned her BA, graduated magna cum laude in cognitive neuroscience with a special certificate in mind, brain, and behavior interdisciplinary initiative from Harvard University in 2000. She later received her master's in public policy in 2004 from McDonough Kennedy School of Government, Harvard as well. Immediately after, fortunately for us here at Stony Brook, and I know it's because of she made her way back to Long Island, where she grew up and now currently resides, when she entered as a PhD candidate and presidential fellow and as a graduate council fellow in our neighbor department here at Stony Brook, that of political science. In 2009, she transferred to our department of sociology to our great excitement here at Stony Brook, where she later amassed a dissertation committee of which I am privileged to be one member. Oh, and by the way, she just completed a certificate in pediatric bioethics at Children's Mercy Hospitals and Clinics as part of the University of Missouri at Kansas City. During all these years, Brooke's been incredibly active in a number of community-level projects that include, to name only a few, her role as president and fellow of the Brooke Ellison Project, which is a nonprofit organization that is established to promote the awareness, potential, acceptance, and support of stem cell research through a broad public education campaign and through grassroots mobilization. And among a list of other accomplishments and activities, of which there are many, Brooke ran the most impressive campaign in 2006 that I well remember as a Democratic candidate for the New York Senate. She's an author, public and motivational speaker, and will, as I mentioned earlier, in less than 1 week from today, be presenting her dissertation defense of her work entitled Lifelines, Stem Cell Research in the Globalized World, as you can see behind me. Brooke's dissertation, certainly to be published, is an incredibly comprehensive, cross-cultural, and cross-political look at the workings of the scientific and medical organizations in 4 states, including the U.S., Germany, China, and the U.K., as they relate to the institutions of religion and government, among many other institutions. The work is really both fascinating, prescient, as well as it explores primarily the way the field, and more importantly, the pace of stem cell research has been affected by the many social forces that often shape technological and scientific or rational progress. It's really quite impressive in its depth and in its analysis, I must say. More than that, Brooke is just an incredibly passionate intellect and community-minded young woman who will undoubtedly do much public good going forward, as I know we can all expect. She is, by the way, a highly respected and highly praised adjunct professor in the School of Health Technology and Management and associate professor in the Departments of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, and has co-taught, among other courses, the ethics of hope to our medical students here on this campus. A more terrific title and message I cannot imagine. It is with great pleasure that I present to you my advisee, Brooke Ellison.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy, for that truly humbling introduction. It's really my honor to be your advisee, so thank you for all your help throughout all of this. And for putting together this wonderful series. It's an honor of mine to be a part of it. And thank you all for coming. I see some of my students here today, and it's a privilege to have them here to share some of my thoughts, some of my work with all of them. That's great. So thank you all. So, as Kathy had mentioned, I've dedicated much of my life to the field of stem cell research and promoting the field in one way or another, whether that was through advocacy work or through political work. And as a student in the sociology department, I wanted to make sure that I could continue this. I could continue my work in advancing this field. That's why I decided to do my dissertation on. It's been a true pleasure. So before I delve too deeply into the nature of my work, we could look at science more generally, not just stem cell science, but science more generally, as it's couched or contextualized in society. And very often science is considered kind of a universalized construct, right? That what we look at or how we perceive of science in, say, New Zealand is very similar to how we perceive it in a place like New York. But sociologically speaking, it's not always a universalized construct. I mean, it's given the priority that it's often given in society because it helps to drive the economy. It helps to drive what's called the knowledge economy. So an economy based on the creation of knowledge rather than products or industry. So really, how does science perpetuate the future of the economy? And sociologically speaking, it's been looked at from two distinct and sometimes adversarial or competitive or competing sociological theories. The first, world polity theory, which looks at science as a kind of a globalized construct, or how networks of scientists interact with one another. And the other, the sociology of scientific knowledge, looks at how culture affects the production of knowledge. How does factors in society or in culture drive the kind of scientific questions that are pursued. But when you look at science as a policy matter, which is how it's increasingly being approached, we have something a little bit different. So here we have, a cartoon of a legislator who kind of looks, I suppose, suspiciously like Mitt Romney signing a piece of legislation. We have good legislation, bad science. And it's affected by all of these different forces. You can see these different things that are represented as rats, whether or not that's a fair characterization is up to people to say, but all different forces working on it. And that's where a theory that is much more relevant to policymaking becomes important for science and looking at science. And one of those theories is field theory, which looks at, emphasizes social interactions and how these interactions affect policy outcomes. And it looks at policy outcomes as a product of different complex forces and social structures that affect some kind of decision that legislators make. And the context in which these decisions are made is called a social doxa. And that's really the heart of field theory. How does a social doxa, or what's called, basically a set of cultural beliefs that organize reality, affect a social outcome? And stem cell research, I decided to apply this to stem cell research for a number of reasons, not simply because of my dedication to the field and my love, my passion for the field, but stem cell research policy is complex in its nature. It involves lots of different epistemic questions or social questions that touch upon the meaning of life, questions of economic the justifiable ends of science and how this builds the economy. So just very briefly, for those who don't know, embryonic stem cells are useful in many regards. They have the ability to, they're unique in their ability to differentiate or divide into any one of the cells in the human body, of which there are over 200, and they are derived from early stage embryos, about 3 to 5 days post-fertilization. Scientists can extract embryonic stem cells, and these are useful because they can help scientists understand the disease at its most basic level, its most elemental level, the development, the nature of human development. It provides a medium for testing drugs and for the scientists to see how diseases develop when they, essentially when they strike. But the problem lies in the fact that when you have different countries pursuing this research, a policy in one country doesn't look anything like a policy in another country. So the stem cell policy in the US looks very different than the stem cell policy in the UK, Germany, and China. So essentially, we have a very disparate and unlevel playing field when we're talking about the pursuit of science. And this is a problem because we have the need for collaborative efforts for scientists across the different national borders. So the fundamental research question in my dissertation is how do these 3 sociological theories, the world policy theory, sociology, scientific knowledge, and field theory, explain some of the differences that we've seen in stem cell policy, especially when we have a very globalized and interconnected world. And at the heart of field theory is the interactions of different actors and how they influence a policy outcome. And there are really very many actors who have influenced stem cell policy in one way or another. But I chose just 4 because, number 1, I wanted to actually finish my dissertation. And number 2, these are the ones who probably actually had the most significant impact on policy outcomes. And this would be the Catholic Church, the scientific community, the pharmaceutical industry, and patient advocacy groups. And although these 4 actors have a globalized and universalized component to them, how they operate in different contexts is very different given the social doxa, given the cultural context in which they operate. So you can start by looking at the United States, which is where stem cell research or embryonic stem cell research really has its home. So embryonic stem cells were first derived in 1998, and in the evolution of its history in the U.S., it's really been under 3 different presidential administrations: the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration. So when they were first derived in 1998, it was under the Clinton administration, and even at that time, there was already legislation in place that was going to affect how this field would evolve. But for the most part, for 8 of the 14 years this field has been in existence was under the Bush administration, and President Bush, early on in his administration, really set the tone for how this policy was going to evolve, and has continued to evolve. So in 2001, we made the very prominent statement or prominent policy decision that the United States would only provide federal funding for research on embryonic stem cell lines that were already in existence prior to this decision, prior to his announcement. And that really set the tone. It took a very moralistic tone for how the U.S. was going to pursue this science. So if you look at this from a sociological context, a theory like world quality theory that looks at scientific globalization and kind of rational actorhood and the autonomy of science or the institutionalization of science, it would help to explain how, since in the years of the Bush administration, different states tried to pursue this research, to try to develop their own economy through the advancement of this research. But it doesn't really doesn't explain why the U.S. didn't rely on scientific advice or expertise as a matter to drive the policy. And from a different opposing theory, sociology of scientific knowledge, it would help to explain why the very conservative political atmosphere during the Bush administration really contextualized the policy. But by the same token, on the other side of the coin, it doesn't explain some of the collaborations or the networks that were created that helped to drive the policy in the years since that time. So here's a picture of President Bush talking to Pope John Paul II in July of 2001 at his Pope summer residence, Castel Gandolfo. So it's really about a month or just several weeks before his policy decision, before President Bush's policy decision. And in his book, The Decision Points, President Bush stated very explicitly that his interaction with Pope John Paul II really drove his decision and drove his thoughts on what he called the culture of life. And that really is the context in which the entire stem cell issue has been created in the United States. So all of these actors, all the actors that I mentioned, are all operating under this context. And the Catholic Church has really driven the policy decision through its collaborations with conservative Christian ideology, as well as the establishment of the culture of life. They're really the driving force behind the policy in the United States. And the scientific community then kind of acts as an oppositional force, but doesn't have the same kind of political savvy or legislative savvy that the Catholic Church certainly does, and acts as an oppositional force, but has had a difficult time gaining its stride in challenging the social conditions that have been put into place in the United States since then. And interestingly, given these kind of tense waters that the policy has been created in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry has been very much taking really a backseat in this debate. It hasn't really been a vocal proponent of or adversary to the advancement of this field, and their absence has been noted and has made it more difficult for the scientific community to help move this field forward. But at the same time, some groups like patient advocates who have seen the field sterilized in terms of life and have worked to reframe it into one of cures, and they've worked collaboratively with the scientific community. So here we have President Obama, who worked to reverse the course in 2009, shortly after he was elected president. But even still at that time, the policy was based on one of moralistic principles on the issue of life. And so here we just have a look at essentially a chart that indicates this relationship with the Catholic Church connecting very well with the pharmaceutical industry to drive the policy in one direction, the scientific community and patient advocates driving it in another. So, from an economic point of view, the United States can be looked at as kind of similar to the UK, but we have a very different set of circumstances. So in the UK, in 1978, really, the whole question of embryonic research was brought to light through the birth of the first quote-unquote test tube baby, Louise Brown. And at that time, many questions of the morality of embryonic research in general were being debated in the UK. And about 12 years thereafter, after a lot of debate, a lot of social debate, a lot of expertise, expert input from members of the scientific community, the UK passed what was called the HFEA, or Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, which worked to regulate embryonic research and solicited the input from different scientific experts. And part of this act was the statement that embryos were worthy of respect, but this respect wasn't tantamount to that that should be given to human beings themselves. And this idea has set the tone for policy in the UK. So the UK policy essentially states it is very liberal in its nature and it allows for embryonic research to be conducted on many different embryonic stem cell lines. So from a world polity perspective, it would help to explain the reliance on members of the stem cell community in pursuing a policy outcome, and the research has a source of economic growth, but it doesn't help to explain why there is some degree of policy isomorphism from the United States to the UK. From a scientific sociology, scientific knowledge perspective, it helps to explain how different cultural features like the birth of Louise Brown and the formation of the HFEA can help shape a policy outcome, but it doesn't explain some of the challenges that the scientific community has still had in creating policy, in furthering research. And so here we have Tony Blair, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he's speaking to the Royal Society, which is a very prestigious organization, scientific organization in the UK, and the social doxa, or the conditions under which policy is created, or science policy is created in the UK, is very much framed around utilitarian principles and the use of science as a measure of expertise. So all these actors operate very differently in the UK than you see them operating in the United States. So the Catholic Church is really given much more of a backseat role. It doesn't have the kind of authority in policy matters that, say, the Catholic Church in the United States might have, and it's in competition with a much more kind of institutionalized religion of the Church of England. And in this policy, the scientific community really takes the forefront as the driving force in how the policy is created. And because of that, because there's a much more certain set of circumstances and the waters are much safer, the pharmaceutical industry has been more vocal in its support for this research than, say, the pharmaceutical industry in the United States has been. And they have a very collaborative relationship then to help drive the field. And the patient advocacy movement doesn't have the same kind of need to reframe the issue that it has in the United States. So we have a very different looking chart here with the scientific community acting as the prominent force that's collaborative with pharmaceutical industry and the patient advocates with the Catholic Church acting as an oppositional force. And Germany represents actually one of the most fascinating cases of stem cell policy making that can really be seen in the world. So Germany is a very wealthy country, one of the economic powerhouses of the EU, and has been, especially over the last 50 or 60 years, been very liberal on matters of social and scientific policy. It's been really a driving force in climate change research and all sorts of things. But for a matter like stem cell research, really the policy can't be looked at as anything separate from or divided from the issue of the Holocaust. That issue sits as defining iconic feature from which all other issues must be viewed, and really how many other actors must behave, really. So as a result of this defining feature, Germans tend to be very wary when it comes to bioethical, biomedical research questions that test the boundaries of life and human rights. So their policy is unusually restrictive and not one you'd expect to see from a country that is typically very liberal. So they allow funding on only stem cell lines that have been imported from other countries, and as long as these stem cell lines have been derived according to the regulations from the country of origin. So say if they're importing a stem cell line from the UK, it has to adhere to UK standards. But they don't allow the derivation of stem cell lines from their own country, so basically they're removing complicity or culpability from their own hands. And they have a cutoff date very similar to the United States that's been updated to May 1st, 2007. It was originally January 1st of 2002. And essentially, the view is that this research is evil, and how do we maximize inherently evil research, but, do it in the most ethical manner. So again, looking at these two scientific theories, or sociological theories, world polity theory helps to explain some of the advances that have been made in different individualized states in Germany, specifically North Rhine-Westphalia, which has its own stem cell funding source. And it uses research basically as a very prominent economic driver. But it doesn't help to explain why there are certain cultural beliefs and traditional beliefs that have basically trumped scientific rationality. And then sociology of scientific knowledge, which again takes a little bit more of a cultural perspective, can help to explain how these iconic cultural events or historic events can have a very prominent effect on policy outcome, but it doesn't help to explain some of the very prominent interactions that have taken place among social actors. So here we have basically an iconic representation of the Holocaust, and really you can't take a question like stem cell research out of this context. It's too profound, it's too culturally defining, and there's also the reliance on a deontological philosophical framework that guides much of German thinking. So again, all of these actors must be looked at in terms of their relation to the Holocaust. So the Catholic Church joins many other religions in German society in terms of kind of having a reduced status, a reduced authority, with a German reliance on secular principles of morality rather than religious-based principles of morality. The scientific community has been notably less vocal on this issue, has taken a position that's a little bit different from many other scientific organizations or scientific authorities, not being quite as vocal in its support. And the same thing goes to the pharmaceutical industry. They have a very kind of difficult relationship with the Holocaust, but has not been particularly vocal in support, despite the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is looked at as a very prominent force to drive the economy. And the patient advocacy groups, despite the fact that this research could help change many of these people's lives, has been essentially silent on this issue altogether and has focused most of its attention on gaining equal rights and protections for essentially for those who have been disadvantaged in some way. So here we have a picture of protesters outside of the German parliament of the Bundestag, and they have this is a very rough translation, but a sign that says, ethically heals best, and killing embryos does not heal. And this is a kind of very secular perspective on the morality of this issue. So if you look at a similar chart with essentially the Holocaust acting as a defining feature, it gets collaborative support from the Catholic Church and the patient advocacy community, with kind of an oppositional, but not very strong oppositional force from the scientific community and the pharmaceutical industry. And all of these can be sort of juxtaposed against a country like China, where essentially there's no input from social actors when it comes to policy-making decisions. And this is a very simplified look at a very complex history, but China has a history of kind of tension with the West and some of the ideals of the West, and a very autocratic or totalitarian regime that really creates policy with very minimal support from different public actors or social actors, and has viewed this research and other forms of science as a profound driver of economic growth. And as China has focused a great deal of attention on stem cell research as a means to create a position on the economic and global world stage, and has focused its attention specifically on translational research, so basically the economic growth or the economic potential that lies in this research. And as a result has put into place a very, very unusually liberal stem cell research policy that really has very minimal restrictions of any kind. And essentially there's not really much in the way of recourse should researchers decide not to follow these guidelines. So basically, from a world polity perspective, it helps to explain some of the use of science as an economic driver and the focus on scientific liberality for the country. But it doesn't help to explain basically the unilateral decision-making that Chinese legislators have used and relied upon when it comes to creating this policy, or to whatever extent you can call it a policy. And then from the sociology and scientific knowledge perspective, there are features in Chinese culture like, the former single-child policy and kind of enforced atheism that's grown out of the Maoist regime that have made conditions favorable for this kind of research to move forward. But it doesn't help to explain the resistance of social input on policy outcomes. So here's a picture of Chinese President Hu Jintao with the Chinese military. And China has really been looked at as a country that's pushed very aggressively for scientific expansion and exploration as a means to economic development, with the government, the Chinese state, really defining all means of reality. So how do all of these actors, similar actors, operate in China has to be looked at through the lens of the totalitarian Chinese state. And basically, the Catholic Church, there's really no role that it plays in any kind of policy making in China. There's a very, very small Catholic representation in China, about 1% of the population. And they have historic tensions with the Chinese government, so they really don't have much of a role to play. But the scientific community has kind of an interesting role. There's a lot of great work going on in China, a lot of promising research, but because of the very liberal policy and the liberal restrictions that are in place in China, there's fears that this research that's going on there can be considered lacking credibility or can help create the wild east of China. And that's kind of a fear of Chinese stem cell researchers as well as stem cell researchers in general. And the pharmaceutical industry in China has another interesting role. It's one of what's called a state-owned enterprise, or SOE, in that the Chinese government owns the majority of the stock in pharmaceutical industries, and they really have the ability to set the tone and direct decisions made by the pharmaceutical industry. And so they very much take the direction of the Chinese government. Then we have the patient advocacy movement, which is, for the most part, non-existent in China. But there's an interesting collaborative relationship that patient advocacy groups have created, through social media and different kinds of interactions with human rights groups outside of the country. And they've been kind of serving as checks and balances on potential abuses or potential problems that can arise out of such an aggressive policy. So here we have basically the Chinese state as the defining feature, with other actors, the scientific community, the pharmaceutical industry working in support of it. But the patient advocacy movement being able to create collaborations with other networks of advocates and human rights groups outside of the country. So really there's not much opportunity for input within the country, but only when there's collaborations with groups outside of the country. So, this was a very, cursory and, I suppose elementary look at, a lot of research that went into some of these conclusions, but, world quality theory and sociology and scientific knowledge are really the two forwarding theories that were in place, sociologically speaking, when it came to the investigation of science. They fit very nicely with a more comprehensive, interactive approach that field theory provides, and helps you really look a little bit more deeply at some of the social conditions and interactions among actors that drive a policy outcome. And going back to one of the first things I had mentioned, that when we talk about science and its lack of universality, it really creates a big problem for how science is pursued. In order to have the collaborations that are necessary, we need to have similar policies or similar approaches in different countries. And without the authority given to science, there's a big risk that that's not going to be possible. And in order for standardization to take place, we need to have science as really the authority in a lot of policy-making decisions. And we could look at a country like Germany that was extremely hesitant to move forward on this research, but has since kind of made its policy more liberal in recent years. As that's kind of a fairly decent example of the need for science. So even Germany, with a too strict policy, has decided to move this forward. And this has implications is certainly not just for stem cell research. Without an authority given to science, we have the potential for widespread social manipulation of many different issues in science policy, whether it's climate change research or nuclear technologies or information technologies. When science isn't given the authority it deserves, it's very often manipulated, and we have policies that are not reflective of the importance that science has for solving some of the very important questions that the world is going to face in years to come. So that's about it. And after all that,